So Matthew, thank you for joining me on this. I came
Thank you for
across
inviting
you.
me, guys.
I actually found you by chance on YouTube. You have a YouTube channel, and you talk about all sorts of different aspects of composing. It's for composers, and what I really liked about how you were talking was you didn't see that there should be limitations in terms of starting to compose. And in a few of your videos, you've made this point that not knowing theory or not having the experience or not knowing how to play an instrument shouldn't be an obstacle to actually starting to write music. And I wonder if you could maybe just start off by saying a little bit more about that. Why is it not an obstacle? And what can be achieved without it, actually?
Well, the reason I think it's not an obstacle is I think the obstacle is probably fear more than anything. Fear of getting started, fear of sounding like you don't know what you're doing. And this is just, tied to the ego and our sense of, how we are viewed by other people. And
Yeah.
I think that this is something that when we're children, we don't really worry so much about. Like kids are not thinking about how good their drawings are. Actually, they get like kind of a kick out of when they're comically bad. Like I was just drawing the other day with my son and we just had like the most fun time laughing at each other's drawings of each other. And so I think that this is something that we have to have the flexibility and freedom to do in music. We need to sort of think of it like just something that we're playing with, like an actual toy. And over time, the more that you practice doing something, it would be unlikely that if you devoted 20 hours to trying to do something that you would be bad at it.
Yeah.
So if you do it for 20 hours, I mean, you may not like make huge strides in terms of your technique and your ability. Like if you drew for 1 hour every single day for 20 days in a row, you would probably be better day 20 than day one. Of course, this comes with sort of like the understanding that you have to sort of be observant and listen carefully to what you're doing. Otherwise, you can just sort of like repeat yourself every day and not make any gains in terms of how you're improving technique. So one thing that I would recommend, like if you are trying to learn composing, is if you have a set amount of time that you want to dedicate to it every single day, at the end of each session, it's good to sort of take notes of what you did and what challenges that you faced. So those are the first things you attack the next day. And really think about it like systematically. And
So
so
that's to
that's why I
build up
think like,
awareness
yeah.
of what's going on in the process.
So then the theory is just accumulated by being observant and listening to what you're doing. Because if you're just sort of like composing blindly and saying like, well, whatever, I'm just gonna make some notes, put them together and hit playback and just be satisfied with the results, then I think that that may lead to going in circles to a certain
Yeah.
extent. Even if you're trying to do things that are in dramatically different styles from one day to the next, I think that you may end up experimenting with the same things conceptually,
Yeah.
which could be like trying to write a melody with accompaniment or trying to write multiple melodies in counterpoint with each other. And so there are different things that you could be trying to do, but it could be that if you're not making notes about what's working and not working, that can make it very challenging. And so it's not really, I really don't think that you need to be going and studying like Bach and Beethoven and Mozart and or even more recent composers like Stravinsky, Prokofiev, Shostakovich, or whoever. But you have to at least be observant of what you are doing.
Yeah.
And so you sort of like, again, generate your own way of understanding theory and your own vocabulary. And there are a bunch of songwriters that talk about that, like John Mayer, Paul McCartney, a bunch of other examples.
I'll be interesting to hear more about what they say because
Yeah.
I'm sort of coming to this point. I'm quite new at composing, and that way of like studying Bach or Stravinsky or whoever, it might work for some people, But this is a channel that's primarily aimed at intuitive composers, and these are people who probably don't resonate. If I was studying I'd be like, well, when do I get to do stuff? This is boring. I don't want to study how other. I mean, by listening to them, I'm probably absorbing stuff, and by listening critically to them, I'm probably getting ideas. But by spending time studying them, I'm not. But at the same time, I'm coming to this point where I'm thinking, well, my stuff is all sounding the same, and I'm approaching everything in the same sort of way. And you're suggesting, I think, just be aware of what you're doing And you suggested to me in a conversation we had recently that maybe to put certain limits around it. So for example, I might sort of block out certain notes and make them not available, or decide to write with a different set of instruments, or decide. You talked about great idea you had. It was about you called it container blocks. So it's almost like I have a tune or something. Maybe it takes 20 bars, and then I need to repeat that idea, and I've got like 15 bars or 10 bars, and then just to see what happens. And I could still be bringing in the intuitive style and just letting it flow as it comes, but with those limitations, and they can unlock something. How far do you think I could get without the formal study of theory? Do you think the formal study of theory is important at all to be able to optimize your potential as a composer, or can it be done without formal study?
Well, I do think it's possible to be done without formal study. And I think that there are examples of great musicians who never study music theory in a formal setting who end up doing things that are super interesting and experimental. If you think about like a visual artist like Francis Bacon was like adamant about not going to art school because it was like too insular, and they were going to be teaching him traditional technique that might be undermining his very unique approach to actually how
Yes.
he produces images.
Yes.
And that would interfere with what he was trying to do and what he was trying to express in his work. And I think that there's value in just having your own isolated kind of vocabulary. And yes, as you said, you may listen to some music and sort of absorb things through sort of osmosis, but I think it's possible to get through without sort of going to a music conservatory or a university to learn music theory. I think that this is one of the this is one of the sort of false or limiting beliefs that we place on ourselves, especially like in the classical music world, that in other musical genres and domains, people don't really think about it. I mean, like, I know that a lot of producers promote, like, when you know theory, it just makes you better at songwriting, which is true to a certain extent, but there are still great songwriters who don't do it. So I think that there may be some things for composers of concert music in particular that are going to actually make you better at composing. And I think at least being able to read music is a huge advantage, because then you can start thinking in visual terms, which are going to lead to breakthroughs in the sonic domain. And so I think that it's going to unlock like being able to look at what other composers from the past do, not necessarily to analyze from a theoretical perspective, but at least to understand how they were combining different instruments, understanding orchestration, understanding the limits of tuba or a
Just to
xylophone,
get some
or
ideas, I guess.
just to
Yeah.
get some ideas, and also just to make music which is actually playable. Because it
Mm.
could be that if you're writing in a DAW, like, I don't know, Logic, GarageBand, Cubase, whatever, you're thinking in MIDI and you're making notes for, like, let's say you can write like the highest note on the piano and you make it for a tuba. Like, the MIDI can do that because it has a sample library that will produce what would, theoretically be a tuba in that register, but no tuba player on the planet can actually produce that note. And so these are the kinds of things that just understanding a little bit about music theory can help. And so it's not necessarily like learning specific chord progressions or specific conventions from different points in history, but just having like a basic way of communicating, I think is helpful. That would be the
Yeah.
one thing that I would say. If there's nothing else that you do in terms of music theory, at least learn how to read music.
And when you say read music, I mean, again, how formal do you think that input? So I understand if you're reading scores from other composers, but as far as your own music goes, if you're working in a door, you can look at the what do you call it, the piano roll on the door, and you can actually see the notes visually represented.
Right.
To me, that's more intuitive, and it's more easily to absorb than a score, because with a score you even got these different clefs. Even if you can read the notes, you've got to somehow mentally transpose them at high speed. If you I can't do that. But if you can see them written down on a score, it's all like, it's almost like every instrument has the same language. It's easier to see, it's easier to sort of visually absorb. Is there any issue with that, or is
No,
there some? Yeah.
no, no, not at all. I mean, it's just another sort of visual language. It's another form of communicating.
Mhm.
The only thing is, like, if you are interested in writing concert music, then I think that concert music should be experienced live. I know that this is a barrier for many people, but I hear you. I mean, I teach music theory in a university, Northwestern in Evanston, which is just north of Chicago. And even like people who are trained in music struggle with the clef issues. I was just talking with a student today who is a violinist that struggles to read bass clef, and just like identifying intervals between switching clefs is a challenge. So I recognize that like if you don't necessarily have that background, it can be challenging, and even if you do, it can still be challenging. But
Yeah.
I think that if you are interested in being a composer, even if you're doing it completely intuitively with no theoretical background, I would probably suspect that you anticipate doing it for a long period of time. So I think that there is time in the future that you could just spend maybe 5 minutes a day. It doesn't have to be a huge time investment to just at least have, more than one way of communicating your idea so that you don't
Yeah,
end
yeah.
up putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
And I think that,
I use Cubase. Cubase has a score editor. So what I've actually started to do when when on this channel when I'm uploading videos, I've started to sort of put the score on the video, and it's quite interesting to see the score of my own piece and try and follow it. It's just an interesting little thing, and I suppose I'm sort of picking up how to read it while I do that.
yeah, so it's not something that you're putting in a lot of effort to try to do. I think that that's one of the benefits of, programs like Cubase or Logic Pro is that they will just generate the notation for you. So I think that that's a good thing. Then it just makes it easier for you to sort of see two different versions of what you're doing. One which is in the sort of like the piano roll MIDI language, and the other which is in music notation. So I think you could definitely get by without music notation. The reason that I say it's valuable is because you can start to experiment with your ideas when you start thinking about how to manipulate the durations, or like you were talking about earlier, putting limitations on the notes themselves. But you could also do that without notation. So this is really just like my own personal philosophy, but I definitely think you could get by without it.
And you're a composer yourself. You're a composer of, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe your style is highly avant-garde and very different, which is probably why you're very open to sort of, more intuitive approaches to composing as well, because a lot of people will, be quite hostile to the idea of not knowing theory and stuff like that formally.
Yes.
Um,
Well,
I just wonder, sorry, go on.
yeah, no, go ahead with your question, and then maybe I
I
can.
was just going to ask you, to outline or just to give a flavor of what your own process is when you compose. What
Sure.
to what extent do you retain consciousness of what you're doing while you're composing? To what extent do you bring conscious direction, and to what extent do you just say, okay, let that work in the background, let me just whatever happens, happens.
Usually there's sort of a process of discovery that needs to happen so that I can figure out what idea I even want to do in the first place. A lot of it is like guided intuition. And so, for example, if I want to write a piece for the cello, first I need to figure out what is the sort of place in which the idea has to live. And so I'll just make some constraints on the kinds of sounds that I can even explore. Or if I have to write for a different instrumentation, like right now I'm working on a new idea for bassoon, cello, and percussion. And so one of the things that I try to do when I write for such like a diverse array of instruments is look for ways to create fusions of color so that you can sort of sense that they're a unified ensemble and not three distinct voices. And so I would try to look for sounds that each of these different three instruments could do that could sort of like undermine how we're able to sort of signify what the bassoon is doing, what the cello is doing, or what the percussion is doing. So you can sort of blur those things. And then I'll make lists of sounds I can do by either exploring the instrument itself, or if I don't have access to the instrument, just think about timbral possibilities. So percussion obviously is limitless. So I might just like put some constraints. Maybe it's just going to be vibraphone and glass. And so how can I make the cello sound like a vibraphone or glass? How can I make a bassoon sound like vibraphone or glass? And then look for like the different sort of overlaps. It's kind of like a Venn diagram in that sense. Like what is that area in the middle? And then I start asking questions. It's like, well, if I'm thinking about it like a Venn diagram, do I always want it to be in the middle? Do I want to sort of create like interesting, you know, counterpoint in terms of how we're listening to the instruments, where one comes out in relief and the other subverts to the background. And so then it's a process of, thinking of directions and developing the materials based on what is currently happening and what is currently not happening. So if everything mostly sounds the same and everything is mostly the same notes and the same rhythms, what would it be like if everything sounded different, different notes, different rhythms? And that's how I could go from one area to another. And the process is like that. I would then intuitively connect the two of them.
Yeah.
And there might be some like specific goal that's happening in the background of my consciousness, but it's usually guided by my ears, and my ears are usually going to tell me like whether I like something or not. And if I don't like it, there's probably a reason, but I don't really unpack the reason that much as I'm composing. That comes later.
So would you say it's in phases? Like you do a little bit of thinking, then you'd switch off and just let stuff happen, and then you'd pause for a bit, do a bit more thinking? Or is it more integrated than that, and you're doing the thinking as you go along while you're composing?
It's more like switching back and forth.
Yeah.
So like yesterday or 2 days ago, yeah, could be 3 days. It doesn't matter. The first day that I started, it's just thinking like, what is the idea? And I basically ended up with like two specific ideas, which are super distinct. And then I make to-do lists for what I have to do for each of those ideas. And then when I start the next session, I just go one thing at a time. So like one of the ideas was like, it's going to be very sound centric and technique centric. So I have to actually play the instruments in order to discover those things. So first step, play the bassoon, make a list of fingerings, transcribe what the notes are, and then record them. Step 2, play with the cello, see what kinds of sounds combine well with that bassoon sound, and write them down. Step 3, play some percussion sounds, and it's just sort of like that. And so I have sort of this like methodical approach to it so that I always stay on track. But like the in-between parts are basically just me improvising on the instruments and not really thinking too much about what I'm doing, but then I'll actually notate the ideas so I don't forget them.
Yeah.
So that's one of the benefits of the notation, is it's also going to help to bolster your memory. And then once you see it written down, that yields even more questions like, well, if I do this, then maybe I can do this, or whatever. Some kind of call and response of melodic ideas. But if I never wrote it down, like I will forget this for sure, because I'm not going to write this particular thing down.
But you've got it on the video now. So.
At least it's on video, so it's recorded. But in terms of like, in terms of as a method of documentation, it's helpful. But anyway, yeah.
It's always really interesting because it's like, you don't often hear composers talking about their process, even like trying to teach a process, the correct process, but it's quite rare to hear them talking about their personal process. And whereas yours is probably a little bit more methodical than a lot of the intuitive composers who might be watching this, it's always really interesting to get that broader perspective. If you send me some links to some of your pieces, we'll put them in the description as well. We'll also include a link to you have a community, composer community, don't you, where people can access a load of resources, get feedback on their pieces, and there are some free classes and things that people can go to as well, which might be interesting. So we'll put the link to that in there as well.
Sounds great.
Mathew, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Guy.